I want to hand it over to Leora Wolf-Prusan, our amazing, incredible, lovely, and illustrious project director, program director, to help us think about the power of naming, the power of creating intentional space to be in conversation regarding our stories and language and what things mean to us. We know that the context is incredibly important and shows up in how we experience things and what we can create. Leora, I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for what you will offer.
Thank you, Oriana. Big breaths from both Candace's words and then earlier Cam's words. And now I have a third C, Cam, Candace, and now the C of crisis, of getting into and mulling and grappling with what crisis actually means to us and to our community. And it's so deeply woven into the words that Cam opened us with and Candace just grounded us in, because the invitation was to build shared narrative. And sometimes we think, oh, that means I have to exactly agree with everything in the words that my community is saying. But actually what I'm going to invite us into is that the shared narrative and the power of shared language can actually be knowing and attuning into where there's difference and when there's alignment, and why ourselves, why we as a community are arriving at a collective nervous system response in the way that we might be. So we're going to dive into this idea of how might we, as Candace was saying, let go of our automatic narratives of what crisis is and has been for us as communities. Yes. Okay. Just as a quick pause check, when y'all, these little mischievous humans on the screen, how many of us are feeling like the peanut butter or the someone getting peanut buttered? Welcome you in the chat. You can share, I am the babe getting peanut buttered, or I am the mischievous one, peanut buttering. Where are we in this moment as we feel and think about our healing? It could either be, I can't even access it because someone is messing with me, or yes, I'm working on it. I might be peanut buttering myself. That's gorgeous. Yes. Yes. Yes, beautiful. I am the kid being smothered. I am being peanut buttered. That might be a new verb we launch at SCRR, getting peanut buttered. This image just makes me laugh so much, mainly because it reminds us that there's actual joy in the sticky stuff for some of us. And some of us also feel like sometimes the way that we respond to crisis or a crisis culture is something that happens to us versus with us. The babe getting peanut buttered. So wanting to just offer that there is beauty in the sticky stuff in the peanut butter, and hopefully I'm not activating any of you who have peanut butter allergies, said with loving kindness. Okay, great. So here's what our work together in this collective renewal strategy of building shared language around crisis can mean in our own sustenance for healing. So here's how I might here's what our session might feel like today. One is that I'm going to offer us of how and why shared language can be a powerful collective renewal move. Just like Oriana introduced yesterday, the power of metabolizing grief. Today, the power of shared language. And then I've got 3 moves. Crisis me. What is the individual reflection around my own relationship to crisis, my own narrative to crisis? Crisis we, part 1. How do we create shared language as adults in our school communities? Very connected to what Cam opened us with this morning. And then crisis we, part 2. How might we actually listen to young people, to the students and alumni of our school communities in their reflection of past, of how they experienced crisis being handled and defined when they were in school with us, so that we can really attune, continue to tap into how we arrive and support continuous healing as school communities. Okay, so that's the 4-parter. We'll see where we go. We'll see where we go. So I want to just take a pause moment to talk about why and how of shared language. Many of you know our colleague Erica Woodland, and Erica Woodland says all the time that trauma and resilience, these words have come to mean everything and also nothing at the same time, because we are using them a lot without pausing to say, hey, Oriana, when you say trauma, what does that actually mean to you? How have you come into that learning? Or Leora, when you use the word resilience, how are you imagining that? Our language deeply informs our practices and our policies. And our language is deeply rooted in our lived experiences and in our values. So if we're just going to the practice and the policy without taking a pause moment, the stop, observe as a collective about why we're using the language we are, we might be missing a lot. And just as Candace was saying earlier, we might actually be colliding without knowing why we're colliding. I'm going to ask someone to just unmute and maybe read this quote that our colleague Jen Leland has offered. So you can just raise your hand or unmute so we can get some voice diversity in the house. Who would be open to reading?
Naming then becomes a form of effect, or do you want me to start at the defining?
Whole thing. Yep.
Okay. Defining crisis and naming traumas in expanded and ecological ways is critical to our work insofar as naming has healing properties. When we can say what feels unsayable, we are less likely to have it dragging us around by the nose. Naming then becomes a form of effect, identification, and is rooted in ancient traditions of naming, marking, affirmation, and witnessing through community and ritual. The naming here is critical for involving the trauma narrative into transformed, reconstructed meaning narratives.
Beautiful. Thank you. So this idea of naming as a collective has healing properties, and it actually has also harming properties if we are living in unshared language and in colliding values, particularly around how we even use the word crisis, how we apply the word crisis, and then how we institutionalize the word crisis. Thank you. Thank you. So let's talk about when we say crisis, what are we really even saying? What are we even really saying? I'm going to invite Nikki to screen share the Jamboard and the link. Thank you, Nikki. I'll stop my share. We're going to go to a Jamboard and we're going to go to page 3 of the Jamboard. There's 3 definitions of crisis. Thank you, Nikki. And you've got the link in, so hopefully you should all be able to access it. I'm going to invite you to go to this page and you're going to see 3 different definitions. And again, some of these definitions you might agree with, and some of these definitions you might argue with. That's actually the beauty of creating shared language, is sussing out where there's alignment and when there is potential collide. So I'm going to offer you a moment to read through these different definitions and then grab a Post-it that's on the left bar, right under the arrow, click on that, and then you can post next to the definition what you agree with or what you argue with. So Nikki just showed you how to do a sticky note, and you've got to post it. So you've got 3 different definitions. I'm going to invite you to take some time to read through them and then share in a Post-it, what do you agree with and what do you argue with? Right? What lands and what does not land? Let's see where we go. Yeah, it could even be language that you really like or language that makes you curious. Beautiful. Okay, so I just wrote, crisis doesn't just happen outside of schools. That's for me, that I'm reminded by in this quote, but I also love in the yellow quote, this idea that it alters how the community holds each other, can hold each other. Yes. Okay, great. Someone is also playing with this. Is the crisis inside the system or outside the system? All right, we've got someone who's, yes, I'm into that definition. It's actually about the emotional stress produced from a situation. Yeah, okay. Loving this. Thank you. Okay, Great, we've got some argues. Sometimes a challenge to status quo, that stability is actually a push towards better health. So we actually have to destabilize sometimes. And that maybe the crisis isn't in the destabilization, but is actually in the stabilization, that's the crisis, is the status quo. Loving that. Okay. We've got some folks who are saying, yes, involves perceived threat to emotional well-being. Agreed. And I want to just highlight that verb perceived. It is subjective, just Candace walked us through. We are all humans coming into a collective community with our own narratives based on past and intergenerational ideas of what it means, of what threat means. And so we're all then colliding with our different perceptions of that threat. Yes. Okay. So some of you are saying, yes, crisis is traumatic. I want to offer that others of you might say, crisis actually doesn't always have to involve trauma. It could involve stress, but actually we might be really resourced because unfortunately, due to social determinants of health, we experience crisis all the time. And so it isn't traumatic. It might be stressful, but we're resourced because we have to deal with it all the time. Yeah. Okay. Lovely. So I'm offering this as a practice, right? These are just 3 quotes. You might have other quotes that you want to bring to your school community to actually elevate and surface why we are using the word in the way we're using it. So I'm going to offer, Nikki, if you can move to the next sheet. Yep. And we're going to do the same practice, but this time, instead of looking at someone else's definition, I'm going to invite us to take a pause moment to think about our own. So when we or I use the word crisis, it's in our title. We talk about crisis all the time. What does it mean to you and why? And most interestingly, for you, how does something become a crisis and why? I'm going to offer you to take a moment of reflection and again, take a sticky note and to drop it onto the June board. And we're going to collectively create our own understanding of what crisis can mean to us. So again, what does crisis mean to us and why? And then how does something become a crisis and why? Yeah. Let's see what some of us are thinking about. Thank you, Nikki. What does crisis mean to you and why? And how does something become a crisis? Okay, beautiful. We're starting to get some text. So it is feeling out of control and unsafe, can be a big C or a little c. Yeah, the feeling out of control and unsafe. And if we were in a bigger room with much more juicy time, I would even ask a second question, which is, what does control mean to you? And what does safety mean to you? And also judge out. And yes, I just said judge, but unwrestle, untangle those words together. Okay, great. We've got some layers in the text. Emotions are heightened and the community is craving a settle. Okay, very connected to what Candace just walked us through, that there's a collective heightening and that there's a yearning for the settling, and all of us might be behaving in a way to access that settling in a different way, or a conflicting way, or a same way. Okay. Let's do one more. Crisis means I'm not safe. It's a situation in which I have to fight to protect myself. Something becomes a crisis by not being safe. Safety is the biggest thing for me in a crisis. Okay, beautiful. And again, we would go even a second layer and say, what does safety mean to you and why? Because all of us have different constructs of safety. And part of our hope and vision for school healing is actually naming that safety does not mean the same thing for everyone. So many of us have grown up through the 80s and 90s and 2000s of school reform movements where we're told safe spaces or school safety initiatives, and it's actually unclear what we're actually creating because all of us have different safety needs. This is beautiful. I'm going to do A couple more, and I hope that you're seeing. So someone's saying under distress, crisis can be a time when we are unable to fully use our prefrontal cortex. Yes, one of the biggest signs of that is if I asked someone to reflect about something and they looked at me like, are you joking? I am handling. That means they might be in a crisis space because their prefrontal cortex is having some pause so that everything else can settle and reflection is inaccessible. Yeah, crisis is ongoing. It isn't an isolated incident. Okay, this is lovely. Some of us might think crisis is related to a death event or school shooting. Some of us might actually say, no, it's the way in which our collective responses value different student bodies, different school communities, and different humans over each other. And that in itself might be the crisis. Yeah, okay. So this is a practice. This is a practice. My hope is that you, through your own little taste of inquiry, are seeing where I'm getting to, which is that all of us have different definitions of crisis. And it's beautifully important to take a moment to reflect on how we got to our own, how we got to that. Was it because of our family narratives, where we grew up? How did we get to that space? Okay, so I'm going to move us back. Thank you, Nikki. I'm going to move us back into this engaging in self-inquiry. So we just did that practice number one, which is taking a moment to pause and engaging in our own, what is our own crisis bias? We talk about grief bias at SCRR, and I want to introduce another term, which is crisis bias, which means that some of us might be programmed to validate some types of crises over others because of our own crisis, what we've been trained in, what we respond to. If you think about crisis response teams at your schools, there might be certain events that categorize as a crisis and certain events that don't. And our collective renewal invitation is to say, why? How might that be? Or even more so, as Candace was pointing out, that some of our practices are rooted in past and not in present. Our student bodies change all the time. Our teaching communities change all the time. And so we actually might have policies that are written for past communities' needs of crisis and not for present. So what could it look like to tap into the right now and reflect on where we are so that we can program for the future? Many of you might be familiar with teacher Gabor Mate, who is a Hungarian psychologist and writer that really invited our culture to say, addiction is the behavior, but there are unmet needs under that behavior. And that was one of his teachings. Another one of his teachings is this idea of signs of behavior. External are actually signs of feelings, but the real work in our healing is understanding the root cause, is getting to that root cause. What he offers us is if we're feeling tired or heavy, or are experiencing feelings of guilt or shame, that is actually a sign that we're navigating sadness. And what he offers us is actually a flip. Sadness is not something to run away from. Sadness is actually inviting our bodies to address loss and heal. And that the question under sadness is actually, what have I lost? What have I lost? That focus. So if we're feeling sad, one of the ways to understand that feeling is actually focusing on loss. The other sign that he talks about is this racing heart, hard to sleep, hard to focus, worried, overwhelmed, panicked. This is often the modality that we're in crisis work. Sending the email, making moves fast, running over ourselves and people. And what he offers us is the gateway feeling is anxiety. We know that A word very well. And that the purpose of anxiety, when right-sized, is to help protect ourselves against threat. And that the question under anxiety is, what do I fear? What do I fear? And number 3, if we're feeling tense muscles or a focus on what's unfair, we hear that a lot in our communities and our workplaces, what's unfair, or there's resentment or frustration, that actually the gateway feeling is anger a feeling that many of us in the education space have been told, or in the general culture, have been told, oh, we don't get to access. But the true operational value of anger is that it helps us defend ourselves and make things right. And the question under anger is, how have I been violated? So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to see, different than me telling why we're doing this gateway feeling work, I'm going to just see what are the connections? How might understanding our root causes connect to the way we respond or make meaning of crisis? I invite you to put that in the chat box. How might understanding our signs or gateway feelings or root causes help us as communities understand or make meaning of crisis? Understand or make meaning of crisis. Oh, sorry, I'll go right back. Let's get a couple folks to share in the chat. How might this teaching of Gabor Mate connect to our shared definition and meaning making of crisis? What have I lost? What do I fear? And how have I been violated? It's a big question. A big question. So I'll share a little bit of my thinking and my wondering. Yeah, okay, Oriana is stepping in. So treating the symptom is applying the Band-Aid, but it doesn't work to change the conditions causing the pain. Ooh, lovely. Or someone else, instead of assigning blame to a person or entity, it empowers the person to dive in internally for answers. Helps an opportunity for reflection and provides insight. Lovely. Okay. Continue to help us make meaning and connection. My intention of grounding us here is that actually when we are responding or reflecting on how we talk about crisis, we're often not going under the layers. We're talking about the event, but not about either the root cause or the feelings around events or what the events surface. So it's a lot of missed data and missed opportunity to connect, create community, and then most importantly, as Cam was talking about this morning, mobilize to prevent these crises and the way we're talking about the crisis from continuing to happen. And many of us lovingly said right now, as adults in school systems, our nervous systems are often on anxiety all the time because the idea of losing a student, or the idea of a school shooting, or the idea of even of rupture is so painful that we are constantly in a fear space. Our invitation right now is that actually having a moment to talk about what crisis could mean for us can actually help us step a little bit out of that fear so that we're able to hold each other when there's rupture with more attention, attunement, and attachment. Okay, so I'm about to offer 3 inquiry questions. We're still in the me space, right? My inquiry, because we can't get into community work without also me work, me and the we. I'm going to offer some personal reflection questions. I'm just going to invite you to think about what are the questions that go, ooh, oh, I don't want to go there. Don't, Leora, if you ask me that question, I do not want to go there, because that's probably the question that we need to sit with together. Okay, so question number 1, what is your personal relationship to crisis? And how might that impact your professional relationship to crisis management and grief leadership? That work that Oriana was bringing us in yesterday. These are not questions for you to answer right now. I'm simply offering them for you to, yep, that's a question you need to do some work on, as a little bit of a take-home goodie bag. Okay, what is your personal relationship to crisis? This is a big one. What is your relationship to ambiguity, not knowing, loss of control, to threat or regularity or normalcy? And where does that come from? It's a lot of personal reflection work, but it absolutely is informing. It is the secret sauce, right? When we can't figure out what is that? What is that? What is the word I'm looking for? Like that flavor in a dish that you can't quite, it's usually cumin, but what is that flavor in a dish that you can't quite pinpoint? All of this stuff, if we don't take the moment to reflect and the work to unpack, is informing everything in the way that we're arriving at work that impacts others and our students. So where does that come from? Okay, and last, how might you describe your relationship to information? Needing it, relaying it, or receiving it? This is deeply, deeply, deeply fundamental to our healing work, because a lot of us have been trained in knowing and holding and getting all the things, either in our interpersonal relationships or in our school leadership. I think about the most beautiful teaching of trauma-informed care when it comes to navigating grief. It is storytelling. It is headline, not detail. I don't need to know the details of your trauma. What I do need to know and hold are the skills to witness you and to hear how you're making meaning of what you're holding on to and how it influences what you're navigating in this moment. But many of us are trained to have to know the details. And I'm going to invite us that actually it's that control and holding on to information. Why did they do that? That's actually out of a space of our own internal experiences of crisis. Okay. That was move one. Internal reflection, collective renewal. I'm going to walk us through two more ways that we can build shared language around crisis and why that's fundamentally important to our healing. Okay, so the first one is collective inquiry around a school's experience and relationship to create shared language. Back for the last 3 years at SCRR, we've been working with Butte County here in California, who's experienced numerous crises defined and held by many different people in their county. Wildfire, many years. Structural racism, always centuries. Endemic poverty, joblessness, etc. And so what we did at Butte County was when there was a moment, this is where you check in with each other. Is there moments and space to reflect? There was moment and space and pause as an entire county leadership system this last winter. And what we did is we posted posters around the room, groups of 4, and asked people to individually first reflect on how they, as individuals, made meaning of the crisis, and then read out their individual definitions, and then created shared definition. I'm going to show you what that feels like. Many of you might be familiar with this diamond exercise. If you have a link to this protocol, please drop it in the chat. I have been searching. I was trained up in the National School Reform Faculty Ways of Being, and I cannot find this, and I want to cite this, but this is called the Diamond Protocol, which is literally creating a poster 4. Actually, you can see on the top, there were 5 people, and so they split, and they took time to first reflect on self, right? Starting with the me. How did or does or might your experiences of surviving crisis change your beliefs about you, your relationship, your communities, and the world? Because this work is deeply about our belief systems, individually, interpersonally, and collectively. So that was the first question. Spent time, then everyone read out. And then the central in the middle was, how did or does or might your experiences of surviving crisis change your beliefs about your work, your place of work, and your community? And then everyone created the shared meaning making in the middle with what that could look like. So again, self, share, in the middle. I'm going to share with you some of the sentences that we then posted around the room, gallery walked, and we call these the crisis we statements, the collective crisis we statements. So you can see, even in the same county, we got to really different vision statements of what crisis work can mean and has meant and will mean for us. So when I'm going to tie it back again to what Cam opened us with this morning, that taking the time to map out, reimagine, and articulate what we're holding and what we are willing to continue to hold together is deeply powerful. So those are all just examples of the difference in one community, Okay, so that's practice 2. I'm going to offer a moment in the chat for us to share about what are we getting inspired by, what are we still curious about with this second practice of first self, then together. Again, these are just ways in which we can tip our finger or a toe into collective reimagining. So in chat, let's take a moment to pause and calibrate. How might this actually land in your own workspace? How might this land in your own workspace? And then I'll go into the third practice. Yeah. So move 1, individual reflection. Move 2, collective we statements. Yeah. We need more collective spaces to heal. Yeah. Spaces of sanación, of health, of creating health in our community, right? So you might not even use the word crisis when you're doing this reflection activity. You might actually use the word health and reposition it, and that's powerful in itself. Okay. Yes, great. I want to really offer that I'm using the word community as an open word for you then to define how you yourself come to that word's meaning. It's actually really important data. Oh, that's such a lovely sentence that one of our colleagues just offered. Perhaps the crisis is not having a community. So when we think about who in our schools often see or hold the most that we don't recognize or validate, we think about the folks who are maintaining our schools, both in maintenance or are driving the buses, or our substitute teachers, or the people who are coming in and out, and because of the way we talk about school community, are sometimes invisible. So what might it look like to bring folks in and to center those that are often watching, observing, and noticing, right? That may not get centered. Thank you for that vulnerable share. I'm going to offer a third way, and then we'll have time to close. So the third way is listening to alumni and students who drive what crisis, who we value and what we center. Our schools, and again, I'm using this word broadly because I know that many of us come from very, very diverse ways and places of work, really diverse places of work. But there is usually and always a population of folks who were with us and now they're not with us. There's a lot of revolve. And our invitation is to actually tap into, I'm going to use the idea of a high school in this moment as an example, to tap into young people who graduate, who are alumni, who have deep wisdom about how they were seen or unseen in their high school experience, and how they experienced us as adults, crisis them or uncrisis them. I'm going to use that as a verb. One of our practices that we're playing with is to ask young people what harms and what helps. What harmed and what helped when you were in our shared space, when you were in our community. And actually in the chat right now, we're talking about what harms. What harms is often invisibling. So we gathered with Youth Move National, we gathered young adults across the country who said, yes, I experienced crisis when I was in high school, and asked them, years afterwards, that's the key and the part of renewal, years after, what does crisis mean to you? And what did crisis look like for you? Because again, oftentimes speaking of power over versus power with, it's us adults who are defining what the crisis is versus with the young people that we're often crisising. And Nikki just dropped the write-up in the text. And I want to point us and move us to the bottom left side. This is a visual map of all the listening sessions that we did with young people. Move our gaze down to the bottom left side, where it says crisis means. And I'm going to ask us to actually do some curiosity, some data looking. What are we noticing that young people said crisis means to them? So I'll read it out loud in case there's tiny font here in the house. What does crisis mean? Impacts the day-to-day and keeps you from going about your life. There's a negative impact on development. Causes change in space and environment. It's traumatic. And then here's the biggie that our young people shared with us. Not ours, actually. They're not our young people. The young people shared with us. Dealing with mental and behavioral health needs without support. Without support. That was the crisis. Not the event. but the lack of being in loving, in secure, and in shared relationship, in community. So I'm going to offer that a third way that we can build collective renewal is pausing, is inviting folks who have been part of our space. I'm going to use that word and maybe instead of community, but in part of our space, who are now graduated or in a different space, and ask them what helped and what harmed. Because so much of the crisis culture is responding, is out of that fear, boom, 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 the heightening. Things then pass, and then we pretend like they never happened. But actually our bodies are holding deep, deep, deep amounts of crisis in them that are just unheld, unpacked, unpacked, and untended to. Right? It's again connected to that verb that Oriana used yesterday, metabolizing. So there is beautiful power in unpacking. How do our students define what crisis is? And by the way, our students probably define crises differently across different students. And how do we as adults, and how might that then inform the way that we hold communities when big rupture happens, One more integration of what I just offered us. Crisis me and crisis we. The first is an invitation for us to reflect on our own relationship to crisis. What events or experiences move us into a place of deep sadness or fear or violation? How do we sit with that? How do we create shared language so that I can say, Oriana, oh, that's your definition of crisis. Leora, that's your definition of crisis. And then together we can be in mutual understanding and reciprocity in relationship. That question under there is, how might your relationship to crisis help others or harm others? It's a big one. It's a hard one, right? What crises might you not be validating because of your own crisis bias? And then the 2 we practices, investing in creating shared language as adults in your school community, and then listening to young adults and alumni and their experience of crisis in the past to inform the way that we hold now and in the future. And I offered some reflection questions and some coaching questions there for you, and we can hold those together as the year comes. You'll also see up in the deck that I posed more crisis reflection questions. There are endless. But I want to just take a pause moment for you in chat to identify one question that you want to hold on to for your practice. One question that you want to hold on to for your practice. I know for me, in our organization, I want to hold on to who did our crisis responses benefit most and least benefit. That's important data. And what do I want to remember from the experience? What do I not want to remember from the experience, and why? So I'd love to see in chat. Oh, I'm going to grab question 2. I'm going to grab question 6. I'm going to grab question 7. Which question is feeling like the entryway to your work, your me work, so that you can get to the we work, not the company, but the collective. Okay. Thank you. Okay, great. 7, what changes should we make as a collective to prepare for future crises? Yeah, that's a big one. I'm gonna end with this quote, and again, these are up on our website. I'm gonna end with this quote from Bell Hooks, our dear teacher, that when we drop fear, we can draw nearer to people, we can draw nearer to the earth, and we can draw near to all the heavenly creatures that surround us. And we deeply believe that doing the unpacking work helps us move or understand our fear so that we can be in more connection and community and reimagine the way that we show up for each other now, then, and in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Ori.